Hello, everybody. Welcome to another interview in Leader's Mind. This is the series where I and my colleagues share the wealth of knowledge that we deal with at Vistage and in other industry organizations that could benefit you making better decisions, knowing more, learning who's who and how things are being done. Today we have Ron Crabtree as our guest. Hello, Ron. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Ron is a person I have met through the searches on the topic of expertise in the supply chain and manufacturing industry specialty. Ron is a veteran of the industry. He is now in charge of the company named Meta Ops, where he uses his vast energy and knowledge to find and provide resources in this industry to the companies that need them. So Ron, would you be willing to tell us a few things about yourself in addition to what I have said?
Well, very good. So yeah, I'm a master Lean Six Sigma black belt and an organizational transformation architect and a certified supply chain transformation architect. I've been into applying as a practitioner all of these kinds of skills for 20 years in industry, mostly in automotive. And then the last 20 years in management consulting in a whole variety of industries, been heavily involved with thought leadership. I've authored and co-authored 5 books on this. I've developed and delivered content and training programs for more than 30 universities and corporations in many countries around the world. And 10 years ago, we shifted and created a new brand we called Meta Experts to characterize an on-demand talent solution for people that solve the most difficult problems on an interim talent basis. And I continue to be very much in thought leadership, involved with thought leadership. I'm currently executive advisor for the Next Level Purchasing Association. Just completed a in-depth survey that we conducted with chief purchasing officers around the world in January 2022. And that's led to a lot of interest in, yeah, it's been a wild ride for the last 2 years, but what's ahead?
Well, the experts are needed when the things are upside down. That is when we need some expertise and experience and insights. I also enjoyed your keynote at the Supply Chain Planning Live, which was an online conference that's still in progress, actually, as of today. Today is Friday or Thursday, the March 3rd, and so I think it's running to tomorrow, right, through Friday. So and it was a good note. It was a very analytical information about what is the top of mind. So let's start with that. Can you tell us right now, when it comes down to supply chain, the trauma that we have gone through in 2021, what is top of mind for the supply chain executives? What are they expecting? What are they fearing? And what is reality?
Well, that's a very broad question because, there's going to be a different answer depending on the nature of the role of the individual. You might ask that too, and also which industry you're talking to, because, we go back to the beginning of the COVID pandemic and 2 years ago, and I was watching very keenly what was going on. And what I was finding very quickly is there were organizations that were crushed. Let's just take anybody involved with flying commercial aircraft, right? Shut that down. So that whole industry was really hurt badly. Mm-hmm. And then there were industries that saw incredible lift. In other words, anybody that could produce PPE or be involved with health related items, and then inferior goods, food, toilet paper, all that kind of stuff. That demand shot out through the roof. And that was early in the pandemic. And then there were some organizations that really was kind of steady Eddie. They were considered essential industries. They were protected, and they managed to get through this without too much malaise. But that was early in the pandemic, and then as the pandemic unfolded, lots of interesting things happened. Then the auto industry, we have the famous microchip shortage manifested, over a year ago. And if we look into other industries, shortages and the inability to get material at all at any price because of spiking demands. One of the unforeseen consequences of all the stimulus money that was spent in the United States. There was like $1.5 trillion in people's savings accounts as we went into 2021 of stimulus money. Well, they had to spend it somewhere. So stuff like recreational vehicles, the demand for that went off the roof, right? And anybody upstream of that was benefiting. And then, food and, now quality in-home goods, all kinds. So any consumer, consumer products, consumer-facing products that people would bring, be it food, be it exercise equipment, be it entertainment, et cetera, demand was out the roof. And then on the flip side of that was, continued struggle, right? For anybody that had relied on a business where you had to physically go and be at the client site, wasn't happening, right? So services sector really took a hit, as did the restaurant sector, as you might imagine, and
Yep.
anybody upstream of restaurants, for example. Now that's since pretty much worked itself out, as we're all well aware, because we're going to restaurants again. Everybody's doing that. So I don't want to ramble on here, but I'll stop there.
Let's focus. I mean, it's a great insight, and it's common that a non-expert asking general questions, so an expert only uncovers the depth of the question that was supposed to be asked. So let's focus on the aerospace industry, including the airplane industry, automotive, and let's say food and drink. So they have gone through different levels of stress. Would you be able to tell us where they are heading in 2022 and 2023? Is there a recovery for them? Is there continuation of dysfunction in which sectors of those industries? And what are we supposed to expect? What do those industries have to expect in the supply chain area?
Well, aerospace is a big domain, right? So you've got organizations that were dependent on commercial flights, right? This would be passenger flights. At the same time, you had industries involved with aerospace and defense, okay, and protection, et cetera. And for the organizations in aerospace, well aligned in government and defense, that kept right on going. There was never no dip in that. If anything, it strengthened a little bit, because here in the United States, there's a huge initiative going on called supply chain. Well, it's coming out of the government, but it's around supply chain security for the country of the United States, and by association, Canada and Mexico, around what we can do to get more effective supply chains versus more efficient supply chains. And the difference is, pre-COVID, the big focus, everybody with all their chief purchasing officers, supply chain VPs that I'm talking to is like efficiency, right? We're going to just-in-time delivery, lowest possible cost, offshoring and stuff to get the cost out, and getting down to a single supplier so that you can get the best economies and all of that. And that got crushed, and we're still paying the price for that on the back end. So the flip side is an effective supply chain, which means it's resilient. You're able to withstand shocks like the black swan event that the COVID pandemic represents. You can overcome, regional shortages. For example, we have, at this moment in time, the Balkans, not the Balkans, but Ukraine, and what's going on there is impacting, the world. And that would be, kind of not isolated exactly, but a relatively small regional part of the world, most impacted with ripples. Look at the price of gasoline in the last few weeks.
So to leverage your expertise and vast insight in this area, as well as your history, so let's focus on the automotive industry. So can you give us a little bit more insight about what are the type of supply chain issues that the automotive industry is right now suffering in light of the strong demand, short supply of automotive products, and any other issues that are happening within the industry? Can you tell us a little bit more what's going on there?
Well, I don't think anybody could avoid knowing about the microchip shortage, and that continues to be an issue. As I was making this presentation the other day, not all automakers are having a big chip issue. And why is that? Right back at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, decisions were made, to slash their orders and commitments around chips. The chip makers, with a big uptick in consumer goods going on, right? Electronics, all kinds, people buying more televisions and toys and what have you, diverted all their capacity. And then when they came back, said, okay, now we're ready to fire up. They're like, sorry, we sold all our capacity. So that was been part of it. Some of the automakers were a little more visionary and protected their chip supply, and they're not being impacted nearly as much. There's been a lot of work onshore, in the United States, North America, or at least in the Western Hemisphere, chip manufacturing, and it's beginning to come online now early in 2022, and understand that'll be making a big difference here by the end of this year and getting out into 2023. So I expect that particular issue to begin to go away. But the bigger issue that I'm hearing about is economic. And this would be, 5x increase in logistics cost of componentry coming in from China, for example, into North America. I've had different automotive suppliers talking about a 5x increase in the cost of basic metals like magnesium. Is a key component going into a lot of automotive components, and the cost of that going up 5x in less than a year. And then they'll have to turn, right, okay, so how do I go back now to the OEMs for price increases? And, the cycle begins to run. So to compound that, we've also had two other effects that have made the automotive industry particularly difficult for the suppliers is unpredictability in demand, right? So the automaker thinks they've got chips coming, they're going to build this number of thousands and thousands of cars. They've got 300 or 400 suppliers all lined up to deliver stuff, and they call them on a Friday at 4:59 p.m. and say, don't let those trucks leave today. In fact, we don't need anything for a week because we're going to shut down and wait for some more chips. Well, that creates a whipsaw down through the supply chain. And the other issue, if you're an automotive supplier, is you operate on razor thin margins, right? You are basically coming up with a whole financial model around supporting the build of X number of vehicles in the succeeding 3 to 5 year period of time, even longer if you're involved with heavy truck and other vehicles with a longer life cycle. Then you got to amortize all those costs, right, over that period of time. Well, the volume goes away, you got nowhere to go. So not only are you getting eaten alive by overheads, your cost of raw materials gone up 100%. I was in Detroit yesterday, and I met with three different automotive companies. CEO of one company, chief sales guy for another company, and then vice president of operations for yet another company over breakfast today. They're all talking about the same kind of stuff. It's like, look out, we got to make it through this period of time and be able to staff our plants, right? Headcount continues to be a real issue. The great resignation, that's certainly rippling out. But the biggest single headache for them is all the whipsaw and supply chain planning and the management of inventory and getting things in, particularly if they're sourcing out of China. Continuing to grapple with that mightily. There's progress being made, and I wouldn't say they're all in exactly the same boat, but it's pretty close. It's the automotive suppliers that are fortunate enough to be in a component of the industry where they're not so dependent on overseas sourcing or a little better condition because they have more local control over cost and probably less, inflationary pressures. But it's just a really difficult problem that is not completely unique to automotive, but not necessarily in other industries. So if you flipped and talked about consumer goods, it's a different story.
Absolutely understood. Absolutely understood. But this is an interesting, to me, this is an interesting industry because it is first very dominant in the US. It has a significant impact on many supporting industries. So it is a much bigger industry than just what we would say is the top 3 businesses that we have, that are now changing hands and whatnot. So we have churned in that industry. In addition, what we know is that some of the dysfunction and some of the price changes that affect such a complex industry can be expected elsewhere as well. So do you have any gut feel or insight or analytics that can tell us what should we expect? Is the automotive industry, because of this pressure from the increasing cost of goods from China and this dysfunction that we are facing in the supply chain, is that going to continue to drive prices up in the automotive industry as far as the consumer index prices?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There will be price increases.
Period. And so, and do you expect? No. The question is how much? Is that going to be one of the inflationary drivers?
Absolutely.
Do you have any ideas as to what is going to be the scale of increase of prices for the U.S. consumers?
I don't, because the automakers really will price their products. The amount of profit they're going to make per vehicle is not the same number, right?
Of course.
For certain vehicle lines, they're going to operate at a pretty razor thin margin. For high demand product lines like, the fancy trucks, right, with aluminum bodies and they're able to charge a premium for that, right? So it's not as simple as you might think. Okay, so for the more commodity type vehicles, I think you're going to see more price escalation because they're just not going to sell those at a loss or a break even. For their premium products, you're going to see those continue to escalate price like they have been. They've been going up 5, 10, 15% a year all along. So I don't see that changing dramatically. I'm not really close to the dealer network as I used to be, so I couldn't say what their view is, but that would be a good question to ask them.
Well, it's basically so anecdotal information about the dealers being the those that add markups to the vehicles right now because of the demand, and they are being disciplined in many public cases by the automakers themselves for doing something that is outside of the contract. That's not uncommon. And so, in other words, if the dealers are finding that there is a allowance that they can charge extra based on the demand and get it, I think that is eventually going to become part of the MSRP. So excellent. So what are you finding in the resource allocation? In other words, what are you finding in the this great resignation? What kind of functions are being most vacated? And are you, when you're helping all of your customers with filling their needs with resources, what are the highest demand functions, if you can tell us?
Yeah, with the great resignation and, the general, you take a look at 4.5 million people changing jobs every month on average here in the United States in the last year, that's having a big impact. Interestingly enough, that dynamic's really affected the IT side of things, information technology types of jobs, and that's been across all industries. It's been the biggest impact. And then, the retirement of the baby boomers is kind of lopping off a pretty good chunk of the thought leadership and, the knowledge, right? The tribal knowledge around how we get stuff done, and that's having an impact. The biggest areas that we are getting demand would be supply management. And that goes from, I need somebody that can be the interim vice president of supply chain because we are just really scrapping here and we've got to get some direction and guidance about where to go. We're getting tons of demand for folks that can jump in and just chase parts and figure out where these sea containers are and make sure we can get these parts in here to keep these plants running, and then people in between, right, that can get in and do material planning. We've got some folks in Mexico that are helping to help them implement a pull system to pull steel through into the steering products, the steering and underbody products they're making. And, there's just a shortage of know-how because people, right, the great resignation and then the baby boomers exiting, and there weren't enough people in the pipeline with those skills. So that's been a massive area, and that's cutting across every industry, and automotive being, pretty heavy because of our relationships. And then secondly, behind that, fairly close follower is, quality. And I'm hearing that more than I've heard it in a long time from chief purchasing officer community, is as we put stress on the supply chain, the quality and the capability from on-time delivery, repeatability, and reliability went down. So there's been a lot of interest in quality engineering. We've got a request for 4 quality engineers all over the United States, California, North Carolina, Michigan, Ohio, just to get in and help them get out of the hole with not only what they're making in those tier 1 plants, but upstream to tier 2 suppliers and the materials and the feedstocks coming into those plants. So, getting in front of that and getting the quality management systems squared back up has been another serious concern.
Got it. And that is, yes. So basically, our system under stress will suffer in different ways. And clearly, volume is one thing, and a bigger issue even is quality. And so that is to be expected. Across multiple industry, if you don't mind telling me your insights into, do you find that any of the industries that are suffering in some unusual or interesting way that other industries could learn from, regardless of whether it is aerospace, automotive, food, electronics, or whatever it may be? Anything that you would like to share with the team that is kind of indicative of things to come?
Well, if I just pivot off this survey we did in January, when we talked about the 3 biggest challenges that they face for this year, the top of the list was inflationary, right? Cost, that's spiraling out of control. Right behind it was supplier development, supplier management, and right behind that was logistics. on time and the cost of logistics, et cetera, et cetera. So from a challenges perspective, that, because we had folks from every industry, largest banking system in all of Europe, for example, is involved with it, right? The largest, RV manufacturer in the world was involved with that for inputs, and then consumer goods companies, food manufacturing, people out of the airline support industry were involved. We had a wide variety, but across all that, we had incredible convergence around what's our pain, right? So if we think about what everybody's learned is, going back to what I mentioned earlier, we focus so hard on efficiency of supply chain, and finally, and when the Black Swan event happened, we weren't ready, remotely ready to have an effective supply chain.
Yes,
which is part of what the government initiative around the security of supply chain for the United States, both for defense, but also for feeding people and making sure we have health care and we're safe and all those other things. And that's created, some push and some momentum in that space as well. But everybody's facing that. But when we flipped to the next question in the survey, we asked those same, folks, okay, those are your challenges. What are the top 3 skill sets or abilities your supply management teams need to have to be successful? Cost didn't make the top of the list. At the very top of the list, 47% of all the responses revolved around just one thing. Well, not just one thing, but this category of supply chain risk assessment, being able to identify, what's going to come at you, being more resilient in your planning, your adaptability, and having the capability to develop alternative sources of supply on the fly and moving away from, single sourcing to dual sourcing, from offshoring to nearshoring or reshoring altogether. And I would say that would be like one of the biggest quote unquote learning that came out of this is there's a price to pay if you're only going to focus on efficiency. I did hear an awful lot, which surprised me in this survey of, chief purchasing officers and supply management folks talking about financial acumen, really having a better idea about should costing for what we should be paying for stuff, the idea of better negotiation skills with your suppliers around tying pricing to indices. So if an index goes up or goes down, and here's the thing, right? So right now, prices are going up like crazy. Well, at some point, you're going to come back the other way. There'll be a correction. Well, they want to make sure that when that correction happens, they're going to harvest that in price concessions. Well, you got to tie that to indices and things like that. And then, it's understanding what are the components of driving, I'll call it system efficiency. When you take a look at price, that's not the whole story. There's something called total cost of ownership.
Yep.
The total cost of ownership takes in everything associated with your supply decision, including logistics, the amount of time it takes for that to happen, the quality of the stuff, what happens when there is a quality issue, the responses of the supply chain to do something about that, the cost of lost business to your organization, lost market share, lost customer satisfaction, blah, blah. All that stuff goes into a total cost of ownership decision. So if we go back to the financial acumen part of this, I interestingly heard more than I've heard before that we need our sourcing and procurement community to have a better financial acumen. We need the finance community to connect better and help us make better enterprise risk associated decisions around sourcing that take into account what it has cost us, or what it could cost us if we have another event. And that's what continue to happen. I mean, the world changes. That's the only constant. And it's not going to get that much better anytime soon. Right? It's going to continue to be a real challenge.
Got it. And that's basically what I'm finding from economic forecast data as well. Of course, economic forecast data that I'm dealing with, has been created yesterday and it's obsoleted today. As the things like the unrest in Ukraine and the Russian invasion and whatnot has been Black Swan event that essentially can sidetrack us significantly. One of the recent things that I have heard is that despite the fact that that part of the world is not heavily relevant to the US as far as the source of goods or commerce, it is impacting things in ways that are either primarily or secondarily going to affect us. One of the impacts that the European automotive industry is suffering from, particularly Volkswagen, BMW, and the Germans and the Daimler-Benz, they are having production of their electric looms, produced in Ukraine, And those are 5 miles of wire that are unique to every single vehicle, that are not interchangeable. And that is at this point a pretty big issue for the Europeans, because that they have found that essentially this is kind of one of the labor-intensive, less complex industries that they have essentially kind of moved to Ukraine. Well, Ukraine is not stable enough to be able to provide that right now, and I think the economic impact is probably the least of the issues that are happening there, but that will impact the availability, increase the demand because the supply will be shorter, and of course that has the upwards momentum in pricing of European cars that we are going to see. And once the competition goes up, of course, what happens with the domestic manufacturers, they will go up as well. So in other words, we can have a part of the economy or part of the industry being affected, and it has a ripple effect on the rest of it.
Agree.
Yep. Any other words of wisdom to the CEOs that are watching this show, that essentially are interested in improving their supply chain situation, or looking for their new resources, or need an insight as to how to be smarter about creating a robust supply chain system in the future, being that obviously we have a change in what is good at this point?
Yeah, I'll answer that with, kind of what we learned from this most recent survey, that supply strategy, supply risk, supply chain management, right, and managing all that is endemic. I mean, I talked with, chief purchasing officer for, one of the largest food products companies in the world. They have plants all over the world making food, and chief purchasing officer, his priority for development of his people is around sustainability, making sure we can get stuff into our plants. He said, he made it very clear, I'm not so concerned about the price. I'm more concerned about keeping plants running and getting food into the marketplace for our customers, right? So that was like, overwhelming. And then second of that would be supplier development and the management of suppliers. This kind of ties into that whole negotiation skills, making sure that we're partnering with the right suppliers, ideas like, creating consortiums of suppliers so you can figure out how to spread risk. And then high on that list, it wasn't as high as, the first two I mentioned, was technologies and the application of artificial intelligence and the elements of digital transformation, or Industry 4.0. Has a lot of interest in the supply community, particularly around the communication of information around, demand signals, consumption signals, how we can asynchronously plan across multiple trading partners, the ability to track and understand where stuff is physically, and then, using that to have better predictives and understanding where your risks are in your supply chain execution, and then planning skills, the ability to understand logistics and better manage the logistics side of it. And the financial acumen and quality systems will all be the key things. But way at the top of that is, if we don't have suppliers that can perform, we're out of business or close to it. So that's got to be the big focus, of being much better at planning for, engaging, and then working with and developing supply chain partners, right, that will be more resilient and effective going forward, and will partner with us then when the economic thing does turn the corner, that we're all going to share in the reduction in those costs at the same time. Would be the biggest industry-wide thing. I heard that every place, every industry around the world, that's the big focus.
Love it, and that is close to my heart as well. I've been working with the companies that are in my Vistage group, and one of the main objectives was, of course, be sensitive to the increase in costs. Of course, then to the health of the ecosystem, upstream and downstream from you, supply chain ecosystem, transparency by those that can make a significant impact, and of course, transparency in your dependents. In other words, your both dependents and those that you depend on. What is their health? What is their ability? And so, in one of the instances working in the glass manufacturing industry, it's a really a messed up situation all the way from the source of silica to the production of the sheet glass, to the lamination and annealing of glass, to the manufacturers who use it to either install it or further process it. Some points in that chain are having more flexibility in increasing prices than the rest of them.
Right.
One of the things I think that goes along with your recommendation was those that can demand high prices should take ownership of the whole health of the supply chain.
Yep.
And that is kind of this integration and some level of intelligence using to make sure that tomorrow we can survive. And the silica guys who are producing essentially and mining these materials may not be as impacted at that point until months later when their machinery is out and they have to pay 3 times as much for it, when the gas prices and energy prices go up, when they realize that their wages are going out of control. So they're not quick to respond in real time.
Right.
An important thing in this case with inflation, everything we're hearing from is to get ahead of it. And so easier said than done, I'm sure.
Yep.
Any final words that we can share with the team of people out here to basically see, should they be smiling when they think about the future? Should they be sweating? What do you think?
More sweat than smiling. You know, I think we're many months away from much relief. You know, I mean, you know, just getting folks to participate in the survey we did in January was not an easy task. I mean, we had to dig deep into our personal networks to get enough data, right, to have a meaningful report, and that's not going away. I mean, you know, you're just not going to get time of day. It's just like simple thing. We need to train our people in better skills. But when are we going to do that when we're working 60 hours a week and
absolutely
putting out fires every day? So there's a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing here. But it's going to work itself out, but it's going to be a while.
Well, so your wealth of information. So how can people reach your analytics and your surveys? How can they see or get in touch with you for presentations or whatever the case may be so that they can learn from your expertise in this field?
Well, you can always find out more about us at metaexperts.com, META, and then the word experts.com, and you know, have a feel for the kinds of talent that we offer to help organizations get in front of this. And we pride ourselves in having the ability to provide, you know, I'll call it crushing the learning curve, and people that have been there and done that grew up in the industry solving these kinds of problems. You know, I do work very closely as an executive advisor with the Next Level Purchasing Association. There's a great source of resources there, recorded webinars, training. You know, they do a salary survey every year that's pretty interesting and publish quite a bit of good research there. And then there's, you know, other sources, right, that you can find on the internet. But you'd want to, you know, like organizations like ProQuest, they've done a pretty good job of pulling together thought leaders and having free events. There's good bits and pieces in there. And then, you know, there are organizations around that bring specific niche kind of knowledge that can be helpful to tap into. An example is Automation Alley in Metro Detroit. You know, they've really, you know, positioned themselves to be the thought leaders in this part of the world around how do we take advantage of technologies. And they've done some pretty cool stuff to help, you know, foster this notion of adoption of technologies and the creative thinking and being able to break down cultures that are stuck to the way we've always done it. You know, go back to your glassmaking example. You know, beginning to implant, getting technology into the lowest ranks of the workforce and giving them an opportunity to think creatively about how I can leverage technology. Still, the chief operating officer told me the other day, he says, yeah, I mean, we had this initiative, we're putting 3D printers into manufacturing companies that would never own one. They'd never think they needed one. And they began to find out some really cool stuff. For example, it was a CNC shop. And they made it available to even the machine operators to get access to be able to print something. And these guys are like, you know, if I had this little widget so I could hold stuff differently or the tool positioning differently, I can get a lot more done. And traditionally it would be brain surgery to get that made, but with a 3D printer, I could sketch that out, do the 3D CAD, print the thing, 2 or 3 iterations, we got it right, and they're off to the races. And that's like a, whoa, look out. You know, that's empowering the workforce at a granular level.
Exactly. Absolutely.
To rethink how we work.
So I appreciate you having all of these resources to offer and to know about. So my recommendation is If you need information, it's probably best to go to the Spider, who has all the springs, all of the lines aware, and that is you in this case. So I will share your information in the comments of this meeting. I appreciate very much your help. Once again, call to action to the audience is if you need an insight into supply chain or help hiring people that are working in the supply chain, please refer to Ron Crabtree, Meta Experts, metaops.com, and I will put those links down under. I think it's good to have a partner who understands the industry, the needs of the future industry, and is on top of it every day. So thank you, Ron, for being a colleague of mine. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.